interest of time, we'll get started maybe a minute early or so. We are fortunate to have with us today somebody that we usually have with us, Dr. Bud Fate. Bud is a very frequent visitor to Energy for All Alaska, and we asked Bud to tell us a little bit about his life, and this program will probably go on for 4 or 5 hours. So so now Jomo has written a brief bio here for Bud, and I'm going to read it because I know you guys all know him, but it hurts Jomo's feelings when I don't do this. So it says, first coming to Alaska for adventure and employment opportunities, Bud Fate had a remarkable diverse experience working in Alaska on drill rigs on the North Slope, helped mapping the Alcan Highway for the U.S. Army during the Korean War, to operating a successful dentist practice in the interior, serving as a Fairbanks representative in the state legislature, all while building and raising a family with a wife, Mary Jane, a powerful leader in the Alaska Native community. So, Bud, with that, the floor is yours.
All right, well, thank you, Jim. You know, it really did take me 2 days to put this thing together, and it was kind of difficult because you can only really make 2 conclusions on the economic outlook in the future, either good or bad. So I thought I'd kind of go over a little bit and cite a little bit of history that has formed the psychology of what went into making of the permanent fund and making what went into causing some of the problems that we see today in the state legislature. In 1939, there were approximately 5,700 people in Fairbanks, Alaska. Now let me get these figures straight here. It was a little mining town, and the economy was based simply on mining and eventually on the University of Alaska, which started literally in 1917, but its first classes opened in 1922. It became an economic driver in this community, but it was the only one that was in this community. Anchorage didn't even have a SNP, didn't even have a community college at that time. Anchorage was based, believe it or not, a lot of the Cook Inlet was based on mining in itself. They discovered, and there was a bigger rush in the Kenai Peninsula, in the Cook Inlet, in 1888, where 60,000 people were considered to go into the Cook Inlet before the gold was ever discovered in the Fairbanks area. So the Cook Inlet was really filling up. The fishing industry, of course, was one of the mainstays. And so you had a state economy really now based on mining, on the fishing industry, and not yet on the military, really, and not yet really to its fullest extent on the University of Alaska. Then comes along 1950 when I got here, February of 1950. And that's when there were 5,700 people, about the same number, 11,000 in Anchorage, about twice the size of Fairbanks at that point. Military had started coming in 1939 in a small scale. And of course, you know, when Pearl Harbor was hit, the military simply exploded in the state of Alaska. And so another economic pillar was created with World War II throughout the entire state of Alaska, both in Fairbanks and in Anchorage. So now you've got basically at that time, you have about 3 main pillars of economy. You've got the military, you've got mining, and you've got basically the fishing industry was still a very big industry. The University of Alaska still hadn't reached its zenith. I think the only campus, which was Fairbanks, was something like, I think in somewhere around the neighborhood of about 250 students. and all the rest of the makeup of the faculty and staff out there at the university. So, but it was becoming a major pillar to the economy of the Fairbanks area. There were 20 gold rushes. To set the stage, there were 20 gold rushes in the state of Alaska. Now think of this, 20 gold rushes in the state of Alaska. There are 3 communities of any size that were a result of those gold rushes that are still extant today. You've got Juneau, which was, Juneau found gold in 1880. You've got Fairbanks. And basically, you've got Nome. Anchorage I don't include because Anchorage was basically a town that grew with the railroad, to serve the railroad, as a matter of fact. So you've got 3 communities out of 20 gold rushes. So now think of the mindset, the boom or bust mindset that was created with all these gold rushes, because some of those gold rushes turned into towns that are today ghost towns. And so the cry, of course, was boom or bust. And yet there was a fairly stable economy before the war. The miners would come in and basically stay in the small towns and communities. The people who lived in rural Alaska did a lot of trapping. And the deep ground, which was around Fairbanks, which was why, as a matter of fact, Wickersham, who had his port in Rampart, Alaska, moved it from Rampart to Fairbanks. It was because of the deep ground, and he rightfully saw that the mining industry in Fairbanks would persist over many years. And so he moved that port from Rampart to Fairbanks, Alaska. I think it was the fourth judicial division. So now we have these gold rushes that have failed. You have a boom or bust economy, basically. You have a kind of a laid-back pioneer towns throughout Alaska that were somewhat populist in nature, as most pioneer towns were. You helped your neighbor. You got along. You didn't mind if there was a 4th Street. When I came to Fairbanks, there was still the old 4th Street line. Most of you know what that is. And you could get drunk. Didn't matter who it was. Be it native or white, you could get drunk and the police would come along, pick you up if you didn't have an address to take you to. But they'd throw you in jail and put you on a work detail the next day, and you worked it off. And then you sobered up and went on to life. Completely different type of social structure than we had today. And so this is the mindset of the people in Alaska as they approached statehood in 1959, and the mindset of the legislators as they grappled with the decade of what I call exploration and development of the oil industry, which was the 1950s. Swanson Field was discovered in 1957. Once again, the Kenai and the Cook Inlet area absolutely exploded. In 1950, they found oil and tested oil in Lumian, Alaska. About only 100 to 120 barrels a day, but it was significant. It was significant. In 1968, of course, the lid blew off, and they found the one at Prudhoe Bay. And of course, the rest is history. So we go into now 1968 and the 1970s. The pipeline started in actually 75. It was completed in 77. The first oil went through it in July of 77. And by 1980, the state legislature was beginning to really grapple with what to do with this huge surplus of money that was coming in because of the oil. Now here we have a mindset of legislators and even the governor at that time, Hammond, who was a great guy. I knew him, and as maybe many of you did. Great guy, but at heart he was a Marine fighter pilot, great poet. but really didn't have any experience at all, if you want to know the truth about it, was somewhat of a populist. Many of the legislators were the same way. And so when, in 1980, they came up with a solution, well, we're going to give a dividend to people who have lived up here for so long, based on how long they've lived in Alaska. And of course, you know what happened then, the Zobels challenged that, and Zobel against the state of Alaska, and the Zobels won. But instead of going back and reviewing the permanent fund and the dividend, they forged ahead on the basis of residency, purely residency. And as you can see, even on our applications today, you're supposed to be a resident of the state of Alaska, and your intention is to become a resident in the future in the state of Alaska. But when I was in the legislature in 2003, I did a little study on this and found that a huge proportion of civil servant workers in the federal, at the federal and state level, not so much at the local level, were actually using their dividend funds to build retirement homes outside the state. We're not even including, of course, the income tax. If you do a little integral calculus from 0 to 30% on everybody that pays income tax in the state of Alaska, you'd probably come up with about a 10%. So that you can add, and ICER helped me on this, you can, and the mobility, incidentally, the mobility of people in the state of Alaska is about the same as many states in the lower 48. Well, this flies against why the dividend, they claim that the dividend was given. One was to keep people in the state of Alaska and to draw people in the state of Alaska. But it really didn't do that. The growth rate really should, in these later years, has only been, what, about 1%. 1.5%. That's not a great growth rate. So you've got a situation here now where you've got a dividend that is based on residency. People are lying about their residency. And then you add into this the military, who have no say in where they go. And yet they also get the dividend for the 3-year tour that they do up here. And part of that, incidentally, is after they've gone a year, they still get that dividend when they're gone. Of course, they wait a year while they're here before they can get it. But they still get it over the 3-year period. So this then is the situation that we find ourselves in. And because the dividend, people really didn't know what the dividend was. And my good friend Wally Hickel wrote the book, you know, or what was it, the owner state. People got the idea that they owned the resources. There's nowhere in the Constitution, where it says that the people have any type of equity in the resources in the state of Alaska. It leaves it entirely up to the government, which is the legislature and government, to determine statutorily how we will use those funds. Is what they did do is put 25% of the royalties into the permanent fund, which was wise. That was one of the good things. Another good thing they did was they added, the legislature statutorily added another 25% to that. If you recall, there's a Norwegian plan that kind of copied a little bit our permanent fund. But instead of making an entitlement directly to the people, they plowed their profits back into infrastructure, into needed services, into developing their country. So now we have a situation where we have what I've, including income tax, have postulated about 25% of the dividend never accrues to bolster the economy in the state of Alaska. 25%. At the present time, there has been $24 billion laid out in the permanent fund dividend. 25% of $24 billion is $6 billion that has been literally given away. Literally given away. $6 billion since 1982, when the first dividend was given. So now, what did that $6 billion buy? Well, would they have put that back into the fund like they just did with this $12 billion that went, that hoisted the amount in the permanent fund from $65 billion now to $12 billion? That's $77 billion that we now have in the permanent fund. But the proceeds from the permanent fund don't seem to make much difference on how we spend, and certainly haven't made any difference on how we've grown and developed the state. And this is the whole crux of the matter. So 25% of 24 billion is $6 billion that we've given away. And yet there is a move on to constitutionalize the dividend. The dividend, taking away the ability of the state legislature and forever putting in concrete this giveaway, literally, of 25%. So if we constitutionalize that, that's exactly what we're doing. We're simply going to give away 25% in the future. And it will be a constitutionally issue. I think that that's wrong, and I think that as it goes down the line, if it gets traction in the legislature, if I have to wobble myself down on my cane, I think I'll do it. So anyway, the $3,000 that now is evident that they're going to give in the dividend now. Every dollar, people don't realize this. Every dollar that we give out as a dividend, it does some good when times are tough. But people at the other end don't realize where that money comes from. So for every dollar that we spend for my snow machine and the dividend when I buy my snow machine, and I sure like that, man, that's great. For every dollar, there's a dollar cost to that somewhere in the budgetary process by cutting back on services or some of the things that we really need. Because instead of that money going into infrastructure, into development, it goes to us. It goes to us. I'm not against the dividend, don't get that idea, but I think the dividend should not be just a matter of state residency, but should be like any corporation. The dividend should be based on the profitability of that institution. How do we do, or how are we doing? How is the state GDP? What's going on? Are we still in a recession? These are the things that should determine whether or not we get a dividend. As far as the militaries go, there's never been any out of the box thinking on that. I'm not even against the military getting it, but getting it immediately, there's ways that you can do that. It take a constitutional amendment to make a special fund for military, the military dividend, and hold it in escrow, for example, for we'll say a minimum of 10 years or something, to where they then reevaluate their application to see whether they truly are going to come back to Alaska. Because now they just write on there that I'm coming back to Alaska. They don't know if they're coming back to Alaska. I'm under dialysis right now. Not right now, but 3 times a week. Got a nurse who said, well, I used to get the dividend. She got that dividend by putting on her application she intends to stay. She no longer lives in Alaska, but she works for a corporation that moves her around. She doesn't have a say. It's like the military. So we've got to do some out-of-the-box thinking that's within the Constitution. Those things have been tested. That's within the Constitution. And instead of making the dividend iconic and politicized, When I ran for office, you didn't dare go against the dividend, and you don't dare do it today. It's just that sacred. And yet you can ask a lot of the people out there, do they know where the dividend comes from? They don't know. They can't tell you. It has become a politicized, trying to grow for the word of universe. Yeah, thank you. But it has become so politicized that today you just, if you're a politician, you just dare not go. So we go back to what we do need in the state of Alaska for economy. And one is leadership. Now, I have my own idea of which governors were good leaders and which weren't. I didn't agree with a couple of them, but a couple were visionaries. A couple tried to do what was best for the state. A couple grappled with some of these things. But nobody, believe me, nobody grappled with a permanent fund dividend. So as we come down to today, we see that leadership then becomes the major factor in how our state progresses, whether it just stays afloat and floats along, or whether it in fact regresses. And I might tell you that I have a citation here. Y'all remember what a CAFCA was? The Citizens Advisory Group on Federal Areas? They had an adjunct called and we were advisors to that group. We authorized a paper that first started as to how the land either could be managed, federal land could be managed by the state, or in fact, under the Constitution of the United States, some of these lands would be deeded back to the state from federal lands. And Utah started this study at a couple $1 million. It was a big study in Utah. They willingly, without expense, gave the protocols and the study to the state of Alaska. We went further on it and studied, and out of that study came a committee called ASLAG. And that report from ASLAG, which is an official report, a state-funded report, has a section in there where it says promises made and promises broken. It has a litany, a list of promises made by the federal government and promises broken. And why do I cite this? Not only is it interesting for every one of you, you can get it right on the web, and it's worth looking at. But the big thing is that where was our leadership? Where was our leadership when all this happened? It might surprise you that after the land claim settlement, I've been quietly working on a co-management, Kathy. A co-management which makes some sense of native lands for fish and wildlife. They don't have any say, basically, in how their own lands, deeded lands, private lands, are managed. We need some leadership, and boy, that's a contested area. We need negotiations, and we need compromise, and we need long hours at the table, but it can be done. There's a few have talked about it. So where do we go with the economy in the state of Alaska, where we have not had the leadership that has either stood up against some of these issues that are harmful to the state, or has at least joined the issues? And there will be more of them coming up. We now have basically 4 legs that the economy of the state of Alaska stands on today. One is still mining. It's an important one. One is the fishing industry. One is the University of Alaska, believe it or not. University of Alaska now, when I came up here, there was just one small campus. There are now 3 major campuses, and I see David back there. I think there's still 11 community colleges.
13.
13 is 13.
13 community colleges and centers. They're all.
Yeah, well, John, they've added 2 then since I've been on the Board of Regents. John's on the Board of Regents now. But that spreads out over the state of Alaska, both in rural Alaska and urban Alaska. So that's extremely important. The fourth is the military, which has grown and is continuing to grow. I might add, speaking of the military, that 16%, the highest in the nation, 16% of our population are veterans. Those are the last stats that I've seen on that subject. And it has Alaska first. If you interpolated how many veterans had stayed in Alaska over the last, since 1982 and the dividends started flowing, it would be high and it would be significant. And I haven't done that math. But it resulted in 16.2% to be very accurate. So now we have economy that's based on those 4 pillars. So let's take a look at each one of those 4 pillars. Mining. It has been in jeopardy and will continue to be in jeopardy, as well as other things like the coastal zone management for waterways, things such as that, because we have such, and I'm pretty much an environmentalist myself. You go to my fish camp, Kathy's in there, she can attest to it. But to be a militant environmentalist and stop growth and progress, like has been attempted and achieved in Alaska over the last 2 decades, is harmful for our development. But we've had no leadership in the main that has stood up against it. Just think, we haven't re-sued, we haven't countersued, we haven't, because there's always saying, well, there's a chance we might lose and we don't want to spend that money. Oh, we're willing to spend 25% of our entire dividend, $6 billion. We're willing to throw that away, but we're not willing to spend money on countersuits or on joining a suit when it's appropriate. We have to wait for a private individual like John Sturgeon to come up with over $1.2 million to try this thing twice in the federal Supreme Court, and the state can't do it? Where is our leadership? So we've looked at the mining industry. Let's look at the military, a bright spot. We're fortunate right now to have people in Congress who each have very defined roles that are positive for the state of Alaska. In the budgeting process with Lisa, the military with Dan, of course, Don has been a strength in all these things. We're very fortunate because it bodes well for the future of Alaska, plus a new interest, of course, in Arctic defense, and with people like Jim around to help us out a little bit all the time, why the future militarily looks good. And that is an economic pillar. The fishing industry, we actually support in many ways the fishing industry, believe it or not. When it comes to revenues from the fishing industry as money that goes into the general fund, there's not much from the fishing industry. As a supplier of jobs and money from selling fish to our people, especially in rural Alaska, it still is a major economic pillar. So you have to count the fishing industry along with it. But the fishing industry is still primarily owned by outside interests. So as time goes on, every one of these pillars get challenged. And we need leadership that will stand up to these challenges. And so far, really, if you really want to know the truth, they've been lacking. So if we can get that leadership, if we can have people that have the vision and the courage, not just the governor, not just the leader in some of his cabinet, but in the legislature itself, where they can address some of these issues that keep holding us back. This state of Alaska, with its resource catalog, with its people, even though it still might be considered kind of somewhat of a socialist state, the people who live here are doers. You know, they don't live in this kind of climate without being able to cope. So people, even though they live in that kind of a social order, they'll get things done if allowed to. But unfortunately, there's been impediments where we haven't been allowed to. So we need the kind of leadership that can do this. And if we do that, especially in a mining area and in the university area, John back there, and I've been on that, I was on the University Board of Regents for 16 years. And we went through, when I was on the Board of Regents, we went through 5 presidents in 14 months. You talked about tough times. The legislature was going to go from 67 line items to 1 and try to control the Board of Regents through the budget process. But we prevailed because, thank God, the Board of Regents is constitutionally authorized. And it's not an amendment. It was originally constitutionally authorized when they forged the Constitution of the state of Alaska. But even so, we can see what's happened here lately in cutting back on the university. And I'm for efficiencies, always have been. I'm for cutting the meat or fat where there's fat that shouldn't be there. But in industry or in business, you don't cut your profit centers. You reinforce them. You get rid of your cost centers, or you don't reinforce them at least. But the university is a huge profit center, not just in education, in an educated personnel that comes down the line, especially in research. We literally multiply the capital that we get for research out there. We bring in more money than some of those grants that we get. So the university is one of the economic generators for the state that has to be looked at. The fishing industry, we've recovered that, probably won't change, but there are some problems in the fishing industry. The king salmon run, when I first started fishing on the Yukon with my wife, out of Rampart, 1965, you had to take the net out of the water. It was loaded down with king salmon to where you just couldn't handle them all. So you just had to basically tie the net up or take it out. Today, you're allowed personal use or subsistence, and that's basically it on the entire Yukon and Kuskokwim rivers. What happened? Well, I'll be darned, in 1938 was the highest production of placer mining in the state of Alaska, 1938. Every stream was running red or brown with mud. Lo and behold, the king salmon catch on both the Kuskokwim and Yukon River was the greatest that they'd ever seen in the same year that the placer mining industry was at its height. Well, that tells me that there's more problems in the blue water fishery. But it wasn't bycatch. The bycatch basically is the same today as it was 20 years ago. That hasn't changed that much. The only difference now is when you catch 150,000 king salmon, throw them back in the water, and you've got people on the Yukon River that can't sell any kings and that are living on subsistence fish. They'd like a part of that 150,000 fish. So the impact is greater when you catch less fish, even though the bycatch is the same. Bycatch didn't change much. Well, what happened? Why is this so? What happened? Well, on the blue water, they found that they had been dumping, I think, reds from the fish hatcheries on the coast by the millions. And so they've been having some of the best catches of reds, Chinook, not Chinook, but chums, than they've ever had. Well, they thought, for years, they thought that each species of salmon kind of fed at a different level, at a different degrees temperature, and degrees and biomass. Now they think that the column of water has basically one biomass all the way through it. And that any species of salmon feed on that same biomass. So if you dump millions and millions of one species in and come up with great record catches of that species, so certainly you will, it's going to harm other species, and it did. It harmed the king and the pinks. So now you've got a question mark on the economy in rural Alaska, because everybody got in on the act when you could sell king salmon, primarily king salmon on the Yukon River. You could make quite a bit of money, or you could make $5,000 or $6,000, which to some families on the Yukon River was spendable income, and it bought them a new film machine or whatever it was. So it was meaningful. Today, that's been taken away, added to the economy. So basically, you've got economies with organized village corporations, regional corporations, and this kind of thing, which is helping sustain the economy in rural Alaska. But something else has to be found out. When I read a newspaper article about it's been about maybe a couple months ago now, they impaneled a group in June to study the economy in Alaska, and they all agreed, this panel all agreed, that we needed more diversification. And I started laughing. Because when I came up here in February of 1950, that was also the cry then. We need more diversification. So for 69 years that I've lived in Alaska, we've been needing more diversification. Well, why haven't we got more diversification? Think about it. We don't have products at the present time that are either light enough to ship by air freight and make a profit against competition outside. We don't have, even though we've got all kinds of raw materials, we don't have a market except our internal market, the local market, which is good for a few farm produces and things like this. But we have to have giant mines or giant producing enterprises before we are able to economically ship things out of the state of Alaska. That really cuts into the small businessman who often struggles to make a living. How many small businesses do you see start up and then disappear in the state of Alaska? It's huge. Absolutely huge. So when people say we want diversification, they never take these things into consideration. It's real easy just to say we want more diversification. There are some things that can happen. Oh, you're completely aware of the iron ore deposit in southeast Alaska that is huge. I understand it's quite rich. We have some of the United States' most greatest coal deposits, and some of it is not just lignite, but is anthracite, is coking coal. But here again, we haven't had the capital. We haven't had, which could have come from the $6 billion giveaway, incidentally. We haven't had the wherewithal to even look at that as a development project to see whether it was feasible. When it comes to rural Alaska, we can do things, I think we can do things, think out of the box a little bit. Is a waterfowl safari, for example, would that be economical, or would that add to the economy of the lower Kuskokwim and the lower Yukon Delta, where the waterfowl are just plentiful, and have a safari? People love to hunt ducks and geese, and have a safari like they do in Africa. I mean, really, the whole works. Nobody knows. Nobody's thought out of the box to really diagnose whether or not these things could work. We need some leadership in the state of Alaska. That's what we need. So the 4 columns that pin up and support the economy in the state of Alaska, out of those 4 columns, I would say that probably the military has the brightest future. Really want to know the truth. But it doesn't mean that you can't be positive, because if you have the right leadership, those other 3 columns will be just as important in the aggregate in establishing a high GDP for the state of Alaska, which we don't have. And so how do we get these leaders? Well, we just have to be people out there I see some leaders right here now. I'm sorry you're still not in government. But we need to go out and recruit people. We need to go out and recruit people that we know have vision, that we know have courage. Because if we don't, we'll still either muddle along like we've been doing, and that's just exactly what we've been doing, is just muddling along. Neither good nor bad. People can go out and hunt and then come home and talk about politics and muddle along, or we can actually regress. And when you stop to think about it, that's a real possibility. So it's up to the voter, but we need, along that vein, better education in our schools, better voter education, so that people know what the stakes are. They know what these initiatives could do. Most initiatives that are floated by the public are more harmful if you really want to know the truth than they do good. And the legislature just simply can't wait. It's 3 years before it can modify them. But that's what they're up against. The legislature can't touch the damn initiative once it's voted on by the people, whether it's good or bad. You're stuck with it. So whenever you go in at the post office and somebody's sitting there with a pen in his hand and said, "Oh, put an X on this thing," it's just a little initiative that it won't do much. You better read the whole thing, or else not put an X on it until you have read it in the paper or wherever else it's made available to the public. Well, I don't know what time it is. I'm just about to spend my. Why don't we a few minutes? But I appreciate this opportunity to not only view some of my ideas, but to give you some plain old hard facts and figures on where we are at in the state of the economy in the state of Alaska. And Incidentally, I didn't get any of this from any other member of the family.
Why don't we, open it up to questions, and maybe it's a little bit different presentation, so if you have input or thoughts.
For discussion,
Discussion.
And Jim, this will be, the recording will be made available online, right?
Absolutely. So, with that, Roger, you have something?
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your comments, Bud, and you've been a figure in the community for many years, and you're pretty well in touch with what's happened. The biggest problem I see today is that we've been so dependent on federal handouts that we've sold our souls. We have not had the backbone to take on the government because all this other federal money. Now, we have a lot of resources up here that if we were given an opportunity, we could become more self-sufficient. I've been involved in the mining industry. I've worked with both the big companies as well as the small individual miner, and it's been devastating. We've just been regulated right out of business. And I have a background in wildlife management, and I worked with fisheries in Southeast Alaska, and I saw the day when we were totally controlled by the canneries, and we're at their mercy, and they squandered a lot of our resources. So I don't know how we can get away from this. The military is very important for our future. Of course, the building of facilities up here to defend this country puts a target right on our back. And if there's ever a world confrontation, we're in trouble. But, you know, we are.
You think, Roger, they're going to shoot us first?
Possibly. Yeah. So I do. There are other people that have something to add, but I've been very concerned about what's happening in Alaska. I feel strongly about the individual and their inability to contribute to our economy.
I share your concern, and I'll make a statement on that regard. And I've basically already alluded to it. The permanent fund dividend is more than just an entitlement. Mm-hmm. It is an addiction. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's an addiction not with only the people who receive it, but the people who have politicized it and used it for political purposes. As far as the military is concerned, I thought often, like you have, but then I come up with the fact that it is one of the main columns of support for the economy in the state of Alaska.
Yeah.
And what would you do without it?
Yeah.
Ask yourself what you would do without it. What would you do without the military work here? It would be a much worse financial condition than you are today. Much worse financial condition.
Kathy?
Thanks, Bud. I appreciate everything that you provided, the enormous territory that you provided with regard to sectors and the historical backdrop. I also think that we need a call to leadership, and as part of that, I think it's really continuing to understand more about who we are. Particularly, I think that there is a lack of understanding among the ANCs between non-native business leaders and political leadership and ANC leadership. And I'm constantly kind of blown away that in 2020, that there is still this gulf. So I think that it's incumbent upon us as leaders in this room to bridge that gap. Because just consider the strong balance sheets that the 12 ANCs residing in the state have. And yet I continue to witness, as people come together to talk about our challenges, that we may organize a conference, and in organizing, ANC leaders of ASRC, Doyon, Chugach, Alaska, Nana, just to name a few, are then relegated to the Alaska Native panel. That you take these CEOs, these world-class CEOs, and continue to lump them together. So I just ask that we challenge ourselves to think about who they are as Stanford law graduates, of Berkeley, of University of Washington, who thank you, UAF. God, my bad on that. But yet, you know, even among these leadership, you know, if you look at a Rex Rock and a Aaron Shutt and a Gabe Comkoff and a Wayne Westlake, they probably couldn't be more different. But not knowing them, you guys don't know that. Or whoever's putting together an event that says, oh, and then let's have our Alaska Native panel, and put everybody in that one group. So, you know, in order to have breakthroughs that are needed, we need to move out of our zone to achieve more. And just think about what we achieved in this Stand Together for Alaska. Let's continue to rally. Let's continue to build on some of that traction.
Bud, that was a wonderful summary of recent.
You're just a good friend, Paul.
You know, it's often said that if everyone agrees with what the presenter is saying, then someone's not listening. I certainly agree with your perspective on the permanent fund. It's been a huge distraction to the management of Alaska resources. If people can't even extrapolate to where that permanent fund comes from, then how can they extrapolate to all of the other things that they consume daily, not just once a year in a check? How can they visualize where all those material goods that are essential to their livelihood, their existence, where those come from? And we have completely ignored that in the state of Alaska. We talk about all these huge resources, that we have enough coal, if we could convert all of the energy in the United States to the utilization of coal, that we could supply the country for 1,500 plus years, and that energy alone. But it's all the other resources that are essential too, and sometimes there's conflicts of utilization. We talk about how important the military is to Alaska. On the other hand, there's trade-offs there. There's the resources that are on the lands that are open to resource development are very, very limited. You talked about the Federal Land Use Planning Commission. When they were deciding which land should be removed and put into these park systems, the question arose, how much of Alaska is open to the mining laws of the United States? And of course, the Alaska mining law is designed after the federal one.
I had a very small little contract from the Bureau of Mines to answer that question. And what was said in the final report, which we put out very, very quickly in a very short period of time, was that in 1977, 76% of Alaska was closed to utilization of its mineral resources. I finished that on a Sunday. We put it on Alaska Airlines. The director of the Bureau of Mines in Juneau came to the airport on a Sunday morning. He took his secretary with him. He went back to the office in Juneau, copied that on a telex, and sent the whole damn report to Washington, D.C. You say there's not been leadership in Alaska. Well, there has been leadership in Alaska. Unfortunately, much of the very successful leadership has been those that wish that Alaska should remain in a pristine environment.
I'm gonna correct you, I didn't say there was no leadership, because I started out by saying I have my favorites who I felt were visionaries and good leaders.
John sent that to Washington, D.C. Within a week, that report was classified confidential. And when that came back, that classification came back, I was livid. Here, this was a publicly funded document that had no reason to be classified as confidential. And we passed that on to our congressional delegation. We also passed it on to members of the state legislature. Larry Carpenter, who was in the legislature at the time, was livid. He just went berserk, and he took the report and he read it into the record of the state legislature, even though it was classified confidential. And he provided some additional money to redo that, again, to reemphasize the significance of deciding how much land was available. We're no better off today than we were in 1976 with respect to the utilization of our resources. In many respects, we're much worse off. When Jimmy Carter signed the Antiquities Act, we had 50+ forest products operations in southeastern Alaska. Today, we have a couple, and they are insignificant in terms of their economic contributions. Alaska has one half of the aggregate timber resource of the United States. The United States and Canada and Finland are the major forest products exporters in the world, and yet we have no access to our timber resources here. The little state of Michigan, we were, in doing this rail study, we modeled what was necessary in terms of freight loads to make a railroad connection between Alaska and the Lower 48 economic. We modeled this after the Wisconsin Central Railroad Sioux line. They handled about 50 million tons of forest products a year on that railroad. State of Michigan, the value added of their forest products industry every year is over $20 billion. That's 8 times what the value of our mineral resources in Alaska are to our economy. $20 billion. And it's because we have no access to the land, we cannot even come close to achieving that level of economic activity.
You know, that brings up an interesting point. Historically, I don't know how many of you know, but in the late 60s, Finland came to the state of Alaska and said that if it could supply 50 years of sustained yield of birch, they would put a plant down at the head on the Yukon Delta. They would train the rural people how to run, how to manage, until eventually they would turn that over. And they were supplying not cants, but they were supplying birch hardwood veneers to make plywood out of it, birch plywood out of it. And they couldn't get a sustained yield of 50-year sustained yield of birch for the simple reason that they couldn't get access. And that was up and down the entire Yukon River. You would have had an industry today, as you say, it would have been a $20 billion industry. And they couldn't get it, and they finally left and went somewhere else. But those are the opportunities that this state has had, and has much. So it's, those basically are blueprints of failure that should be noticed, and if not copied, corrected. Find out what went wrong, study them. We don't do that.
Other questions or comments?
Bud, you got a blood boiling.
I had a question. I wonder what you thinks of the north, and by that I mean Northwest Passage, potentially a new breaker. 5 years it'll take us to get our third icebreaker. Is there an opportunity coming though for the world and for Alaska in the next 20 years, with shipping, and if we just pay attention and get ready for it?
Well, I think there's a great opportunity, and that gets me on another tangent of mine, which is a railroad. And once again, Paul can confirm this. We have oil shale on the Arctic that is probably bigger than all the combined non-conventional oil plays in the lower 48 states combined. But as you all know, it takes a certain kind of sand to develop that. That sand is heavy. You wouldn't even have a chance running that sand over the highway. You just couldn't. It couldn't be done. It'd tear that road up probably the first week of travel with those huge trucks carrying that sand over. Plus the fact you'd have to have laterals to go into where those sites are from the highway itself. But a railroad could do that. So a railroad through the Arctic flow to a port, because to answer obliquely your question, yes, I do think that the Northwest Passage will eventually open up. We've had climate change for millennia. They're trying to prove that somehow we humans are the cause of climate change. That's preposterous. Whether we add to it or not isn't the question. The question is, I never see in any climate change information put out, I never see any description of how far the Earth's axis is off and wobbling. It's off at 8 inches to be exact over the last 2 or 3 decades, and the Earth is wobbling, which influences climate. The wobbling of the Earth in its orbit around the sun is huge in climate change and varies. The magnetic declination, when I started flying, I went up here 40, 50 years ago, runway was, I think it was 99 or something like that. Now it's 02. 3 degrees off. 3 degrees in that length of time, magnetic declination. You never see undersea volcanism. New satellite, infrared, new satellite imaging has shown that there has been new volcanism in the North Atlantic, which they never had even suspected. You never see these things in the mention of climate change. I'm a great believer in climate change. It's been happening ever since the Earth began. What's new? We just need to understand that it's going to change and be prepared for it. In the 10-year period, the National Science Foundation's, in the 10-year period, spent $30 billion, $3 billion a year in the universities across the United States. And the charge was to show that humans had caused climate change. So when I was in the legislature, I got up among a crowd of 1,000 people in Dallas, Texas. And I said, why didn't you spend that $30 billion on learning how to mitigate the results of climate change? Because it's here and it's going to continue. And hopefully they'll do that more and more. They're beginning to do that now. But it just goes to show you that how things can get traction and actually run you off course. Anything else? Steve?
Thanks, Bud, for a great talk. And I agree with Dr. Metz that it's good talk. So on this side, I want to make a comment. Plato, I think it was, maybe a loose interpretation, but made a statement that a community cultivates what they honor. You're talking about a lack of leadership. Look around the community and talk about, look how they treat your leaders, right? Who wants to stand up for that? We're not cultivating leadership at all in the state.
You're right.
So what are we? Okay, so that's the pregnant question would be is, what are we cultivating? What do we honor?
Money.
Good comment. Good comment.
Transients.
On that front, I've been interested in your thoughts on income tax. I see it a whole bunch of different ways, and just interested what you see in it.
Yeah, it's very simple. I was raised on income tax in the state of Alaska, and as a last resort, income tax never hurts anybody. But as long as we're giving $3,000 or $1,500 or whatever the dividend is, and then take it away, it doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense. So, if as a last resort to balance our budget, and we should balance that budget, to balance that budget as a last resort, we come up and we don't have the development, the gross product in the state of Alaska to balance the budget. Then I say as a last resort, we might entertain a tax. But not until that is exhausted, and we have not nearly exhausted it. They just put $12 billion back in the fund. It was $65 billion, and I'm not going to, pre-think them and say it was wrong, because it does build up the corpus. But from 65, all of a sudden it went from 65 to $77 billion that we now have in the corpus of the permanent fund. If we would have put that $24 billion that has been spent in dividends, we would have more than reached the $100 billion, and at 8%, which is what the fund has been doing over the years, at 8%, which is huge, it's great, you should copy it. At 8%, that's $8 billion a year, which far exceeds our expenditures. Just think of that. And then truly, you could have had a dividend, not as an entitlement, but based on how the state of Alaska is doing. If you want to give a dividend out, then that's fine. So that's my kid.
And I agree that, and I would never, it's wonderful talk, thank you very much. The thing about, and I don't want to go too far down the rabbit trail, the personal income tax, in my mind, it doesn't necessarily use it as a means to support the state government, but it provides a level of ownership, and we've created a mentality of entitlement to where there doesn't seem to be any skin in the game, so to speak. We've got the oil industry up north, and it's different than West Texas, where you can drive through, see the industry, you can smell it and see it. It's so far removed from most people in Alaska, they have no concept of it. Whereas if there was an income tax, at least they would have some sense of belonging and contribution and ownership in the state, rather than just, I have to have my dividend each year.
Good point.
Okay, anything else before we let Bud, go back to retirement?
Thanks for the opportunity, Joel.
Has there ever been any talk of a permanent fund just for the university? where it has its own corpus that produces
Yeah,
a
but
dividend that.
it's difficult because the Constitution doesn't allow, basically, you have to have a constitutional amendment.
Okay.
And that's one of the problems. The general fund is the fund from which these things are sold.
Yep.
And then the permanent fund was
Interesting.
was created along with
They're doing
railroad.
okay.
That's
We went to the hot springs.
So that's also unconstitutional,
and
that's not statutory.
Gotcha.
had a good
There's another 25%
chance
that's going in from royalties,
with Bernie.
above the 25%.
Energy.
There's another 25%
I could go on pretty fast, but she's
They can still play with that. The legislature can come on.
string.
Gotcha. Just
She can't speak. She has to.
being deliberate, right?
Yeah,
right.
Little pad that, then,
Yeah.
she's alert, she can hear. But, basically a death sentence,
She's out at the hospital.
But, what's that?
She is.
Oh, yeah, she was, we had a good chance to visit her. It was good for her. So, that went well, and when we came back, of course,
I'm fortunate to have my marbles
we
with
had
me.
to add one turtle.
That's why I was wondering that you guys had opened it up. Yep.
But we didn't locate the queen. I got befooled my ear.
Really?
I had to
Well,
have
Bill Walker had one of the
it out.
That's what Bill Walker.
Not in the canal, the yellow hair canal outside. But, we need to check, see whether the queen, what to do. And DeVos is thinking about splitting up the, I don't know whether that's,
I don't know. Possibly.
Hasbro?
Yeah.
Do an energy project?
Anything, like a summer.
Where is it?
Yeah.
Well, I'll see if I should hit you up.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of, lighting upgrades.
Okay.
Nothing really interesting other than sort of the
stay there or will,
reduction,
back.
but.
We'll plan to circle around, we'll give it another couple months.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's not now.
I just noticed there was something that needs to
In the warm parts of the day,
build season.
Yeah, a lot of my stuff is inside or. But that matters.
Yeah, I think, it tends to be a little bit here and there.
They had
Oh, baby, oh, yeah.
Sunday.
Any day.
Oh.
Sunday was the due date.
This is first, as they landed, on their legs.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
So we'll know when they
Thank
get here, right?
Oh, because
Tuesday morning, we're gonna.
See, I really don't, I don't know that much about it. I really appreciate your help.
I'm glad. Getting kicked off the thing, is all right, because I do think as soon as we get green up too, they'll be
Yeah,
funny
they'll
for
be
them
all
to go
over
to.
the place, yeah.
When they plant me, I'll retire.
I'm gonna plant
So you
more
get reassigned.
clover, right? We have quite a bit of clover there,
Well,
but I'll probably put it.
Well, if get people to thank Joel for the opportunity.
Put more seed.
Yeah, hope you weren't disappointed.
No.
So, yeah, it's,
Although I may have to scrub out whatever you people have been
we
saying
gotta
over the course of the last 5 minutes.
get going.
Well, one of the things that I forgot to